Hey guys, and welcome to Barrel Age Faith. Today we're going to be responding to Cameron from Capturing Christianity about the nature of Peter. And he recently had a video about his archaeological discoveries. Well, not Cameron's, but a discovery of a discovery in Bethesda about Peter in a Byzantine church. So let's go ahead and take a listen to the video.
Okay, so clearly the inscription says that Peter is the chief of the apostles. But before we talk about the implications of this phrase, let's first talk about the historical significance of the find for the reliability of the Bible more generally.
So first, I want to say that I appreciate Cameron. His channel has brought many people to Christ, which is awesome. Uh, Recently, he has been much more open about his own commitment to Roman Catholicism, and so he's creating videos that are targeting Protestants. And now he's had a recent one which mentions the Byzantine East and Orthodox and the claims of the Papacy. So I just want to respond with a few different points today to kind of balance out his comments in his recent video, which I think may have been even published today. So we'll go ahead and continue to do that. But first, I do want to mention we're going to find that we agree on a lot here in this opening statement, and then we'll move on to ways to sort of balance out his statements.
This discovery is yet another example of the early church honoring certain locations for their historical significance. The Bible records Bethsaida as the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, again in John 1:44. And what do we find here? A Byzantine-era church dedicated specifically to Peter, built centuries before modern scholars debated Bethsaida's location. And importantly, this matches exactly what we see across the Holy Land. If you've ever been there, early churches are built on sites that they believe to be tied to Jesus and the apostles. And in this case, their confidence was so strong that by the 5th or 6th century, they constructed an entire basilica on this spot. And by the 8th century, a bishop traveling through the area confirmed its presence. And that's the key takeaway here. The people who lived much closer to the time of the apostles believed this was the location of Peter's hometown. And now, 1,500 years later, modern archaeology has backed them up. Now, that's just a little about the historical significance.
Okay. So yeah, of course, we agree on the historical significance in that the early Christians remembered where all these like amazing events happened with our Lord. And when Christianity was legalized, many churches were, raised, built upon these sites in the first few hundred, particularly after Constantine, but even before that, churches are being built in these areas. So we're in agreement with that. It's amazing. It's beautiful. They became places of pilgrimage and shrines. Many relics were placed in these places where Christians would go and travel and venerate these relics, which is truly beautiful. Now, this is where it's going to turn to the papal claims. And so that's where I want to really address that today as Cameron continues to move on here.
What about the theological implications? This is where things get pretty interesting. So let's start with what the inscription actually says. It calls Peter the chief of the apostles and, quote, the key bearer of the heavenly kingdom. These aren't just like generic titles of respect, right? They have serious theological weight. Chief of the apostles doesn't seem like just the first among equals. The Greek word koryphē, when applied to a person, means head, leader, or chief. It's not just saying that Peter was important, it's saying that he was the leader of the apostles. What does that mean? This directly challenges the non-Catholic claim that Peter was merely first among equals. The Byzantine Christians who built this church weren't saying Peter was just another leader among the 12. They were saying that he was above them in rank in leadership. He was the chief of the apostles. And importantly, this wasn't written in Rome, right? This was found in a Byzantine-era church in Galilee. And that's significant because it means Eastern Christians, not just the Latin West, recognize Peter's unique leadership.
So we should say that Peter being called the chief apostle is all throughout Orthodox liturgies. And so it's not really a surprise. I mean, many Orthodox commentators talk about this, and we'll get to that here later in the video. But I'm just saying this is not a big surprise to find that the liturgy of the Byzantine East of the Orthodox Church matches, which we find in archaeology. But here he's going to swing it to the papacy.
Byzantine Christians were willing to use this kind of language for Peter. That raises serious questions for those who reject Catholic claims about his primacy. And then second, the key bearer of the heavenly kingdom is a very unique role that is given only to Peter in scripture. So this second title, key bearer of the heavenly kingdom, is an unmistakable reference to Matthew 16:19, where Jesus tells Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now notice what the Bible doesn't say. The keys are given only to Peter. Some non-Catholics argue that since the other apostles were also given the authority to bind and loose in Matthew 18:18, Peter wasn't unique. But here's the problem with that. Matthew 18:18 never says that the other apostles were given the keys. Now that is super important actually. If the other apostles could bind and loose, it doesn't mean that they actually had access to the keys or that they were given the keys. The keys represent authority that is passed down, as seen in Isaiah 22:22, where the keys...
Let's pause there before we get into the Isaiah 22:22 New Eliakim argument. So, Cameron makes a specific reference that the other apostles didn't receive the keys. So if you go to the Gospel of Matthew, of course, Jesus gives the keys to Peter in Matthew 16, and then Matthew 18 uses very similar language to the apostles, but the word keys are not mentioned. Therefore, some people are like, oh, only Peter got the keys. The other apostles didn't. They only can bind and loose, but they don't have keys. The problem with that is that, particularly if you're arguing it from a Catholic perspective, and I'll give a couple of reasons why it's kind of a problematic way to say that, is because it contradicts, first of all, Catholic theology. So if you're coming from a Catholic perspective, you got to be up to date on the Fourth Lateran Council, which basically you can find this anywhere online, but basically it connects the sacraments with the keys. And not only does Catholic theology does this, biblical studies, if you look at the work of Dr. Michael Barber and many works, the connection of binding and loosening and the keys with sacramental actions, you find scholarship that points to this. So this is what the Fourth Lateran Council says in Catholic theology. Nobody can effect the sacrament except a priest who has been properly ordained according to the church's keys. So they connect to ordination of a priest, which Jesus Christ himself gave to the apostles and their successors. So right there, Catholic theology says Christ gave the apostles and their successors, that would be the bishops, the keys. And then it argues, but the sacrament of baptism can be performed by laity if needed in emergency situations. So it says it there. Later on, the same council says that the keys of the church are connected to penance, which, of course, the sacrament of reconciliation or confession would be connected to the work of the priests, aka the bishops and presbyters. Okay, so right there, Catholic theology would contradict what Cameron's saying. Now, I think he'll adjust his statements after he talks to like Eric Ybarra and Elijah Yassi and all the Catholic apologists who think about this night and day. They'll say, well, the bishops receive it through the Pope, or the apostles receive the keys through Peter. That would be closer, more accurate way to say it. But to say that the apostles just don't have the keys, not only does it contradict that Lateran Council, it contradicts the fathers in so many places. You can look at St. Jerome, St. Augustine. Oftentimes you find this in the fathers when they're saying that the angelic life, the life of celibacy and monasticism, is higher than the married life. You'll see them contrasting John, the beloved disciple, with Peter, saying, oh, but John's life, his lifestyle of like celibacy, his lifestyle of the embracing the angelic life, shows that like not just Peter received the keys, but all the apostles. So you can find all those references like online. So the fathers say this. Even Catholic theology says the apostles have all received the keys. The place where you find this kind of like error is oftentimes low-hanging popular Catholic apologetics. Those who are in this all the time just don't say things like that. Now, we are going to move on to the New Eliakim argument that is based upon the connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. But before we do that, I just want to say, again, that idea of the keys and binding and loosening. I have other videos where I talk about Dr. Michael Barber's journal article on this, where he connects it to sacramental acts, right? The actions that bishops and presbyters, priests, perform in their churches. And it makes a lot of sense that the keys are connected to excommunication, which bishops perform. They're connected to the Eucharist and church discipline and all those things. So that's that's pretty just kind of common knowledge. So let's go ahead and continue listening to Cameron talk about the connection between Isaiah 22 and Matthew 16. Now, I know this is important to him because it led to his Catholic conversion, like a big part of it. He was on the Matt Fradd, Pints with Aquinas, Matt Fradd with Scott Hahn, and he's got his calculator out and he's calculating like the probability of the papacy being true. And this argument's very persuasive for him using biblical typology. So let's go ahead and listen to his argument connecting this archaeological discovery with uh, Peter.
Key of the house of David is given to Eliakim as a symbol of dynastic succession. But in the ancient world, the person who held the king's keys had unique authority, an authority that could be delegated, just like we see with the other apostles, but the authority was not equally shared. And now we have physical evidence that this exact interpretation of Matthew 16:19 was embraced by the Byzantine church at least as early as the 5th or 6th century, way before the Eastern church split from Rome. And also keep in mind that this was an inscription, so the belief had to have been around before the inscription was actually put down. Does this find prove the papacy? No, it doesn't prove it. Does it prove that Catholicism is true? Also, no. But does it increase the probability that Peter was recognized as the singular leader of the apostles in a way that perfectly aligns with Catholic theology? I think the answer to that is yes. At the very least, this discovery should make non-Catholic Christians pause because this...
Okay, we are pausing. Let me go ahead and exit out of his video here, and we'll continue talking about the new Eliakim argument. So let me go ahead and share a slide with you. But first, talk about a couple things as I'm doing that. The people that have made the new Eliakim argument very popular today would be, first and foremost, Dr. Scott Hahn. And then in the YouTube world, you would see someone like Swan Sona making this proposal. You've seen it on lots of debates and lots of places. Before I get into that, I want to say two things about, or something about those two men. You're not going to find anybody kinder in the Catholic world and more thoughtful and kinder than Dr. Scott Hahn and Swan Sona. I've met them both personally, both amazing, wonderful people. Okay. And I hold deep respect for them. They are both advocates, though, of this new Eliakim argument. So going from Isaiah 22 to Matthew 16, and then directly to the papacy. This is like all over the internet. I mean, you see Trent Horn making these kinds of arguments, Joe Heschmeyer. They're just like literally saturating the whole web. And what's important is for us to, as Cameron says, pause. Let's slow down. Let's think about these things, and also consider the Orthodox perspective of ecclesiology in relation to these claims. So let me go ahead and share a slide with you here real quick of a reference to the new Eliakim argument. So what is the new Eliakim argument? It basically says this, that in Isaiah 22, the king of Israel is appointed a right-hand man, a prime minister, and he's given the keys. And these keys allow him to sort of lock and unlock the kingdom, bind and loose. And he's like basically the number 2 guy, the representative of the king. When the king's gone, he's the number 1 guy. And so they take this to the papacy. Oh, well, King Jesus has ascended. Therefore, the Pope is the visible head of the church on earth. He's the visible prime minister. And so when Jesus is talking to Peter in Matthew 16, the very first thing that's on his mind is the papacy. So it's a very top-down approach. Catholics tend to start with a very sort of judicial, administrative mindset when it comes to what Christ is doing with ecclesiology, with the church. Very first thing I'm going to do is appoint a pope, a prime minister. It's like his first act before he even establishes bishops in Matthew 18. Protestants reacted to that heavily, and they really emphasized the priesthood of all believers and the laity. And so really, in much popular Protestant theology, everybody's pretty much the same as Christians. The laity, they're just chosen to become teachers and ordained to become teachers in a formal sense. But really, it's a much more flattened understanding. Orthodox really began ecclesiology, that is, understanding the church and offices from a place of worship. The bishop gathered with the presbyters and the deacons in the divine council and the divine liturgy, offering up worship to God with the people of God, the laity, laos, people of God. And that's of course, you see that in St. Ignatius of Antioch. That is where Orthodox ecclesiology tends to really begin, is in the context of prayer, the context of worship. Now, that being said, what do we do with this new Eliakim argument? Was Jesus thinking about like establishing a prime minister, a number 2 guy in the kingdom in Matthew 16? Well, that would be a very long conversation. But I do want to say this. We don't have any explicit references in the Fathers connecting Isaiah 22 to Matthew 16, except for one by an ancient church teacher. There's just one. And this is it. What's fascinating is he doesn't connect it to the papacy. He connects the new Eliakim argument to Peter, to the pastors of the church, to the bishops. This is very common, by the way. You'll read a lot of St. John Chrysostom. He speaks very highly of Peter, but then connects a lot of that language to the bishops and the pastors of the church. So this is what he says, and I will give him the glory of David. He will command, and there will be no one to contradict him. I will put the key of the house of David on his shoulder. If he opens, no one will close. If he closes, there will be no one to open. In this passage are also prefigured the realities which are ours. Whatever you bind on earth, he says, will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So the only person connecting these two is Theodoret in the far east, okay, in the east. And he is basically saying that, yeah, the bishop is Peter. Like, this is where this connection comes from. So there's not a huge issue with making these what we call typological connections, the typology, where like Peter is like a new Eliakim, or Peter is like a new Moses. I'll talk about that Moses connection here in a second, but first I want to connect an interview that I did with Swan Sona a few years ago. Let me go ahead and share that with you. He admits that this is really the main point, that the main explicit reference that we can find in the early church to this new Eliakim argument. Let me pull it up here for you. Again, Swan's awesome. Love the guy. Very thoughtful, way smarter than I am. He's just super intelligent. He's going to do amazing things. But this is what he does say in our interview. I have this longing to reunite with the Orthodox. Is it Ephraim of Syria? I think he may bring it out. Like is the Isaiah 22 to Peter and Matthew 16 connection drawn out in a couple of the fathers? I even think, is it Ephraim of Syria? I think he may bring it out. It's not like everywhere, but
yeah, Ephraim the Syrian, we thought for a while that he was the earliest source on this, but then we realized that he wasn't. So he references this high priest named Simon, who has the keys of the temple, but he's referencing, I believe it's the high priest Simon in 2nd Maccabees. So he's making an allusion there from Peter of the New Testament to Peter of the Old Testament, or excuse me, Simon of the New Testament to Simon of the Old Testament.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
The earliest textual allusion where it's explicitly stated, right, that there's a connection between Matthew 16:19 and Isaiah 22 is Theodoret of Cyrus, who's a bishop of Antioch in the 5th century, I believe. So, I mean, one of the things to note is that he is one of the principal commentators on the book of Isaiah among the patristic fathers in the patristic era. So, I mean, it's no small thing that we have him, right?
Well, I mean, when you say, okay, so there he admits that, like, that's pretty much our main go-to, and that's he's building a case upon the Isaiah 22 to Matthew 16 connection, but he doesn't say in that interview that it doesn't connect it to the papacy. It connects it to the bishops, the pastors of the church, which is a very common read when you get to the fathers, when you're doing a lot of typology around Peter. You also can find this with Saint Ephraim of Syria, and Swan brought him up in regards to Simeon the high priest. So let's talk about Simeon the high priest, and I want to talk about Moses, because you also find Saint Ephraim of Syria, wonderful ancient church father that I talk about on this channel, because I think he exhibits the beauty of the early church in such awesome ways with his hymns and poetry. Saint Ephraim will also connect Peter with Moses in some texts. What's interesting, though, and this comes from the Catechism, The Living God, with Father Oliver Clement, French theologian. But he even notes that like Orthodox really view the bishop like Moses and and Peter like Moses. He goes on to say this on page 309 in the second volume. If we compare the bishop's role to that of Moses as he led the children of Israel across the desert to the promised land, priests can be compared to the 72 elders of whom God said to Moses, I will take some of the spirit which is upon you and put it upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone. So think about that just for a second. If St. Ephrem is connecting Peter with Moses, okay, but makes no like direct connections to like the papacy, though some Catholic apologists will make that jump. A natural read is this, that Moses and Peter are like the bishop, or the bishop is like them. Why? Well, Moses is surrounded by presbyters, right? That's the Greek word is for elders is presbyters. Moses is surrounded by elders. You got Moses, presbyters. He's surrounded by them, like the chair of Moses. When you look at the bishop, who's he surrounded by? The presbyters. When you go to the book of Acts, the apostles are appointing presbyters in every city. So St. Paul goes to a city, he's surrounded by the presbyters that he's appointed. So you see the apostle with the presbyters and their assistants, the deacons. Okay. So you see that three-level parallel going on there. When you get to St. Ephrem's connection to Peter being the new Simeon, who holds the keys, when you read that text by St. Ephrem, which I've read that over and over and over and over again, he's clearly making a connection to the priestly actions of sacramental ministry. He's not making a connection to the papacy. He's talking about forgiveness of sins and sacramental actions in the priesthood. And so St. Ephrem basically says that Peter receives the keys of the kingdom from Jesus. Jesus receives them from Simeon in Luke chapter 2 in the temple, the old man Simeon who's in the temple waiting for him, and then also makes an allusion to the Simeon who's Simeon Maccabeus in the book of Second Maccabees, who becomes high priest. And he wears vestments of the high priest. He oversees the temple. And so St. Ephrem is using this language to show that we as pastors, not me as pastors, but the church as pastors and bishops, they've received their authority from the apostles, from Peter, from Christ, from Simeon the high priest. And it could just keep going to show that these priestly keys have like a typological sort of continuity to it. So when you study the ancient text, what do you see? The bishop is called the high priest. St. Ignatius of Antioch calls the bishop high priest. And I have other videos showing this, that the bishop is called high priest, even in ordination. St. Hippolytus of Rome, in those ordination ceremonies to the bishop, calls the bishop directly high priest. And the presbyters are surrounding the bishop are the priests, and the deacons are the Levitical ministers. So you see that threefold office going on there as well. And this is kind of just the natural sort of typological read going on there. Okay. So whenever we're going through the fathers and we're trying to jump from, Peter directly to the Pope, you've really got to look at the whole big picture. Now, I'm not saying that you can't connect Peter to primacy in other offices besides just bishop, but all those other offices relate to the bishop, because an archbishop is a bishop, a patriarch is a bishop, metropolitan is a bishop. They're all bishops, right? But they have extra canonical responsibilities for the sake of unity, which we'll talk about here in just a second. So, in responding to Cameron, those are the first 2 points I wanted to make. Number one, the apostles all received the keys as well. This is clear from Catholic theology, Orthodox theology, and the fathers. Okay. Secondly, the new Eliakim argument is no slam dunk for the Catholic perspective, because there's only one reference in the ancient church, and it goes to the bishops. So if anything, it leans more in the Orthodox perspective. But I mean, when you really study Catholic theology as well, they would admit that bishops receive the keys, and that even the bishop is a Peter, because if you read Saint Cyprian, he obviously says that the bishop sits on Peter's chair. So even Catholic theology allows that. So a lot of that is kind of more an emphasis. Catholics will say the Pope is the Peter, and the bishop is sort of kind of a Peter. In Orthodox ecclesiology, you see more of a sense like the bishop is Peter, and that the archbishops and other primates are a type of Peter, maybe perhaps like an icon of Peter. We should note that Peter is also like a prototype bishop. The keys are given to him, and the fathers will talk about how he, in receiving the keys, receives them on their behalf. And so he's kind of like the representative uh, of the apostles receiving the keys, and they also receive it through him. And they also become what he is, right? So if you study the book of Acts, St. Paul becomes what St. Peter is. The first half of the book of Acts, it's all about St. Peter, right? People are being healed in his shadow. He's speaking, he's preaching, he's doing all these things. Well, what's going on in the second half? You don't even hear about St. Peter in the second half of the book of Acts. Why? St. Paul is doing the exact same things that Peter did. And that's why St. Paul is also called a chief apostle, right? Rome is founded on the chief apostles in their blood. They're both, martyred in Rome, St. Peter and St. Paul. He's called a chief apostle. He's doing the same things that you see St. Peter doing. St. Peter was doing the same things that you see Jesus doing. Now, I'm not making any kind of like one arguments to disprove the papacy. I'm just trying to create a broad picture to help us see that, there are these connections that are going on to show that what Peter was, the apostles become, particularly as they spread out to other nations, right? When they're in Jerusalem, it's sort of like you've got Christ and you've got Peter and you've got the apostles. They're all gathered together. But as like the apostles go to the nations, they are the bishop. They are the high priest with the presbyters gathering around them wherever they go. For example, St. Thomas in India, right? He goes there. He is the chief apostle when he's in India, and he's gathered by presbyters, and then bishops will flow from that, and they sit on the seat of St. Thomas. But he receives the same authority that Peter has. So he's considered sort of the prototype bishop. Peter is. And he's also the place where like the keys come through and pass through. That could be a longer conversation. If you take this to the level of primacy, if every bishop's a Peter, you can also take it and see that like even an archbishop is a type of Peter, or even an abbot of a monastery is a type of Peter, right? Even an abbot, let's say he's sacramentally a priest. He is in some sense equal with his brother priests that are monks. But since he's appointed as their father, canonically, as the abbot, he has a special place to be sort of the icon of Peter in that community, in that monastery. And so it is with an archbishop or a patriarch, right? So if you take the patriarchate of Antioch, not only is he historically, like Rome, a successor of Peter, but he's also functioning within a Petrine see, right? So Antioch is not just a successor of Peter, it's a Petrine see. And this is, Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch are all called Petrine sees. And so he is the icon of Peter. He is the Peter, even though the bishops are Peter and sit on his chair and have received the same sort of sacramental keys and same powers. The patriarch has a special role to play within the synod, within leadership. I want to take us, though, to the Assyrian Church of the East, which is a church that broke off. Sometimes they're called Nestorians. They broke off, at the Council of Ephesus. That's a long story. I'm not getting into that today. But, there's this book called The Church of the East. And in this book, what I like, one of the reasons why I like going far east is that they're really far away from Rome. And when they think of Peter, they think of Peter in ways that I'm talking about in this video. They don't think that, oh, I've got to go through Rome, or I've got to think of Rome first as Peter. Instead, Rome is really just kind of another metropolitan see, or another patriarchate, or another, archbishop, a place of an archbishop. And so when you read this book, Church of the East, you see that they start with Simon Peter for the succession of their bishops. Okay. Probably can't see that. They start with Simon Peter. And then, and by the way, this church is sort of based in Baghdad, Iraq. And so they see Simon Peter, as the beginning of the bishops, like the origin, the prototype bishop, who sends St. Thomas the apostle to their region, who sends Bartholomew, then Thaddeus, then a guy, and then Mari, and Abras, and Abraham, and Jacob, or Jacob, a relative of Joseph. And so it goes on. And so they see Peter as the origin of their episcopate, of their bishops. But they also eventually, around the time of the Council of Nicaea, which this book also will talk about, they begin setting up a Catholicos, or a patriarchate, or a metropolitan see to oversee the other bishops. And they say that this bishop, Archbishop Papa, Catholicos Papa, he becomes sort of like the Peter of the community. And so they see their bishops as Peter, but their patriarch is also the Peter to them. Let me share a little clip from Reason and Theology from a few years ago with a representative from the Assyrian Church of the East describing this.
Every bishop is, the chief priest of his diocese, and, the patriarch should be invited to come in. I could not imagine this being done in such a mechanical way, though, because, he is our father. He's the Peter of our time. He's the Andrew of our, we have these complex Oriental ways where you can name someone with 57 words instead of one word. It's a warm relationship, but yes, every bishop is the only ordinary authority.
Mm-hmm.
So canonically, the case would have to be taken up to the Holy Synod out of his diocese with a legitimate cause. There to be.
So there he is describing the bishop as the chief priest. He is the Peter, but if you think in familial terms, their patriarch is a Peter. And when you read these letters from this book, they date these events happen in 315 AD, before the Council of Nicaea. And it says that the bishop Papa wrote to the West. Again, this is taking place in Iraq, so everything is in the West, right? Constantinople, Alexandria, Rome, Antioch, and they just list they just list off these cities, and the West responds to Papa and says, "You are to set up a patriarchate or set up a Catholicos. You are to be the Peter to these people." And it doesn't list Rome as first in this list, by the way. It just says like Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople, and it just lists them off and says you are to be like that to them. You can see some of my other videos where I describe this a little bit more in depth, where these letters are sort of broken down, but I'm just describing this because this really just kind of fills out the picture a bit, right? Where, yeah, I mean, if you're just trying to say Sola Peter is the Pope, there's a problem there. And I'm not actually saying that Catholics are saying that, but that comes through really quickly in a million different YouTube videos that people are just like taking in and not seeing the fuller picture. And so if you study this, you really see the bishop as sort of like Peter in the hard sense. Like he inherits that the office, these keys, the sacramental actions, and the archbishop and patriarchs are really kind of like a Peter in a softer sense. St. Augustine says that Peter held a primacy over the other apostles in the same way that the deacon Stephen held primacy over the other deacons. That's kind of an example to show you that the distinctions that we're making here when it comes to Peter being a type of icon of primacy is the same sense where like Saint Stephen, who was martyred, is like the archdeacon of the deacons, like sacramentally the same, but he, in some senses, like their spokesperson as he is martyred. He speaks on behalf of the deacons because of his holiness and his wisdom and his own martyrdom. And so he's kind of like an archdeacon. So it's kind of like a soft primacy there, which Orthodox ecclesiology doesn't have a problem with there being primates within a synod in a conciliar manner in the church. Now, I understand there's a much longer conversation to be had. But This is all very important when these sort of like quick little arguments are being made, like, oh, Peter, the Pope is Peter. Here's these reasons, and so case closed. But people need to be, studying these issues much more in depth. I think Cameron and I could have some really fun conversations together if he was ever interested on this topic. A good book is by Dr. Edchinsky, Papacy and the Orthodox. John O'Malley's book on Vatican I, good book. These books on primacy in the church are very, very helpful in understanding Orthodox ecclesial models. When it comes to understanding Vatican I have read Bishop Castor's book, which has been helpful to me in understanding what Vatican I was trying to say. It's a good sort of thing to read with this Vatican I book. But in the end, I do think Vatican I was, in the end, condemning the Orthodox perspective, which I think is like the original perspective, where a council is, even though the Bishop of Rome participates in the council, I think overall the council is over the Bishop of Rome. There's other books. For example, I've read, Eric's book, The Papacy, Adam DeVille's book, Orthodoxy and the Roman Papacy. There's a bunch of Orthodox books that I've read. You Are Peter by Oliver Clement, Two Paths, which, whenever I'm talking about these books, I can critique each one of them, but The Church and the Pope by Robert Spencer, all sorts of books on these topics. Zazulis's book, Eucharist, Bishop, and Church, is a very helpful book. All this to be said, I just noticed that when people watch a lot of these videos, it's easy to be like convinced by these new Eliakim arguments or these quick arguments, and then people make quick decisions. And I think it would be helpful for them to go a little bit deeper. And so I talk to Protestants I talk to Protestants who are trying to decide between Catholic and Orthodox all the time. And it's helpful for them when we are able to slow down and break down these connections and see how Orthodox ecclesiology actually works, and where the limitations are sort of baked in. So in the end, I appreciate Cameron, but I felt like it needed a little bit of a response just because he was specifically talking about Orthodoxy in the Byzantine East and how we need to consider the Vatican I papacy. That's what's baked into the papacy. And really, when you get into the Middle Ages, what's the Orthodox response? Well, Dr. Edchinsky's book talks about that. It's like this elder brother, this archbishop who had a role to play, exceeds the limitations and boundaries of his office. And so he goes from elder brother to monarch. And that's the biggest critique that you see coming from the Byzantine East. And now this monarch believes that he has authority to override certain actions that the conciliar church have performed, whether that be canons and other examples from apostolic tradition. And so waiting for him to return as elder brother who not only guards apostolic tradition, but also restores apostolic tradition, that which has been lost. For example, even restoring something like infant communion would be a very generous act by the West to show it's serious about restoring unity with the East in this kind of regard. Restoring infant communion, restoring ad orientem, restoring fasting traditions, restoring synods and patriarchates. But synods, people, if you haven't restored apostolic tradition, then synods can get a little out of control. That's kind of the crisis that the West finds itself in, is like synodality without apostolic tradition is like, that can get pretty chaotic pretty quickly. Just look at the Catholic Church in Germany. But restoring synods and patriarchates and even creating new ones in the West would be a generous act to show and distribute that power in combination with apostolic tradition, embracing that framework towards taking taking steps towards reunification. And I still have a passion for that, like a desire for reunification between the three big theological streams of Syriac, Greek, and Latin. I think these are important. Even Dr. Timothy Batistas in his book Ethics of Beauty, wherever that went, Ethics of Beauty, even says that we need the Semitic mind, the Greek mind, the Roman mind to balance out what it means to be a Christian. So I think those are important. But this, I do believe, is sort of the I do believe this is sort of like, a helpful approach when it comes to understanding what's going on here. Now, I should say that there's different models of Orthodox ecclesiology, and just in the same way that there's different models of Catholic ecclesiology, by the way. I mean, can the Pope become a material heretic or not? What are the limits of his office? You can look at the spectrum in the West of different positions on the nature of the papacy. There's different positions on that. Before Vatican I, if you look at Florence and Trent, and you look at all these places before Vatican I, there was even broader perspectives. If you look at what was going on in France, what they were saying about the papacy, they would say the council was over the Pope. Now, it wasn't the same way as Orthodox ecclesiology, but what I'm saying is even in the West, there were positions that were much closer to the Orthodox position, but those were all condemned at Vatican I, which the Eastern Catholics sensed was a problem, and that it was going to sort of be very disruptive towards, original ecclesiology of the first millennium. And so our prayer is that, over the coming decades and centuries, that we can grow closer to each other rather than farther apart. Now, I'm getting tons of comments, tons of questions, which means I can't. I mean, if anybody wants to throw in a super chat to help bless my 7 children, feel free to throw that in there. But I'm not going to respond to all these comments that I've got right now. It would be if you want to get a super chat in there for me to respond to, feel free to jump in and do that. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and get ready to jump out of the video. But again, I appreciate Cameron. I appreciate his work on capturing Christianity. Decent guy, good guy. And I appreciate many of his videos. But if he's going to be getting to this realm of okay, Orthodox, take a look at this, then I think it's important for us to take a take him up and have an open dialogue about that. All right. Anybody have any big questions on here today? It's great to have you all here with me. If you're interested in the Wise Phone 2, I was just telling, I think like a young man over the weekend. I was at a monastery, St. Gregory Palamas Monastery, over the weekend. It was just a wonderful, blessed time. Really came back from that restful, sort of ready for the great fast. But anyways, I was telling a young man about the Wise Phone 2 and he was like, after I told it to him, told him about what the Wise Phone 2, he was like, this sounds kind of like a phone made for Orthodox, or like a phone made for the great fast. And I'm like, yeah, it really is. Like, it has no web browser, it has no email. It's a basic phone, but it functions like a smartphone, where it's got a very good camera, texting. It's got maps to get you places. Like, I use my maps on this phone to get to the monastery over the weekend. You can find restaurants. It even has apps that you can use as tools. So there's no apps for video games. There's no apps for social media. There's no apps that are distracting or lead to dark temptation. But rather, the apps that are on here are just used as tools. Banking tools, fitness tools, tools that are just kind of like to function in life, real basic. So you can get $40 off through my discount code KING and get the Wise Phone 2. And I think it's going to do good things for your life. It's done good things for my life. And it could for you as well, as we try to escape the toxic world that we're in, that this internet can be. So anyways, I hope that this video has been helpful for you today. You guys have a great one. Stay tuned for my interview with Father Joseph Lucas coming up. And should be up probably tomorrow when we talk about the Church Fathers, his new book on how to read the Church Fathers. All right, guys. God bless. Have an amazing day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.